So today we're going to start talking about fungi or fungi. You can pronounce it either way. I love this quote. It says, "I said you are a fungi, not a fun guy." Makes me laugh. Okay, let's get on to the topic of the day, fungi. Originally, Linnaeus categorized fungi as a plant. And that was because it grew out of the ground and it wasn't mobile, and it was that way for centuries. And then as we started looking a little more closely and more detailed, it doesn't have leaves, doesn't have chlorophyll, so it started becoming its own kingdom. The other thing to note about past ways of classifying things was that originally people would say, is it either animal, vegetable, or mineral? Right? Those were the three categories. Well, mineral meant not living, so fungi wouldn't be in that. And then you were only left with animals and plants. So out of those two, you would think, well, it's probably more closely related to a plant if you just looked from the outside, right? It was a reasonable assumption. But as we increased our technology and microscopes came along and genetics came along, then the fungi got promoted and got their own kingdom. So let's look at some of the characteristics of fungi in general. We are still in domain Eukarya, and most fungi are decomposers, and they are really the best recyclers around. They enable certain elements to be taken from dead things and then recycled back to the ground and then used again by plants. We'll go into a little bit more of that. Fungi, as I said before, have no chlorophyll. They're not photosynthetic. They are mostly multicellular. The exception to that would be yeast, like baker's yeast that you use. That is a unicellular fungi. Most are non-motile. And then one of the things that makes a big difference between plants and fungi are that the cell walls of fungi are made of chitin, whereas plants are made of cellulose. And of course, animals don't have cell walls. So there are the three distinctions of the different kingdoms. But they are actually more closely related to animals than plants. Remember, we said in the last slide that when people were just looking at characteristics, you would think that maybe they're more closely related to plants because they're not motile. They live dug in the ground, rooted in the ground. But based on genetics, they are actually more closely related to animals than plants. And the thing that makes a fungi is that it's a specific type of absorptive heterotroph. That means they digest their food externally and then they absorb what's been digested afterwards. So their digestion precedes ingestion. And you'll hear me say that several times because it is a very distinctive feature of fungi. As I said, most of them are multicellular, and here is just a picture of what you typically would think of as a fungi. These lovely mushrooms on the left are multicellular, and of course the yeast on the right is a single cellular fungi. So a mycologist is somebody who studies fungi, and the word myco comes from the Greek word mykes, which means slippery or fungus. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at how they acquire energy, and some of this this is kind of in comparison to others that we've seen, and so this should look familiar to you. So as we are looking, our fungi fall under heterotrophs, where they can be absorptive parasites, because remember, not all fungi are these lovely cute mushrooms. Sometimes they can be absorptive symbionts, so they can be in a symbiotic relationship. And the kind that we're most familiar with are what's called saprotrophs. Saprotrophs just means that they get their energy from dead or decaying material. So that's another kind of fancy word for decomposers. And only unique to fungi is that they are absorptive saprotrophs. So those are the three different categories as to how they get their energy. Now, you guys may have seen a little bit of this before. The plasmodial slime mold, for instance, should look familiar. They were saprotrophs as well. So let's talk about where our lovely decomposers fit in the food web. But to begin with, let's start with our producers. Okay, our producers are the autotrophs, self-feeders. So that's going to be the plants and like our cyanobacteria. Those are our primary producers, which then get consumed by the primary consumers. And then secondary consumers then eat our primary consumers, and then way up here is our tertiary consumers. Those are usually our hunters. Well, at every stage, at every level, each one of these eventually dies, including our producers. And what happens with every one of these is they go back down here to our decomposers. And our decomposers return the organic material from each of these layers back into the ground to be utilized again by the primary producers. So the fungi are decomposers, as are bacteria and also some earthworms. So they do play a primary role in the food web. So what would it look like without decomposers? This picture is a picture taken from the 2018 Hurricane Florence that hit in Wilmington. And this is I-40 after the hurricane. All of these fish piled up on the road, right? Really gross. But these fish would just lay there if it weren't for decomposers. I had a student one time say, "Wouldn't that stink?" Well, technically no, because the stinkiness comes from the decomposition of these bodies, which require decomposers. But you wouldn't want all this to pile up. You have to put that nutrient back into the soil somehow. And so that's why our decomposers are so important. They recycle the nutrients in an ecosystem, returning the nutrients to the soil. And they decompose dead bodies. They also decompose waste. So sometimes we forget to mention that, because nobody wants to talk about poop, but it's true. It gets broken back down by decomposers and put back into the soil to be used as nutrients for our primary producers. I think most of you all are familiar with the carbon cycle and how it gets, just like we talked about with the food web, you have the primary producers that take the carbon dioxide out of the air, put it into sugars, and then we have our primary consumers, and so on and so forth. But the important part of what I wanted to talk about here is the decomposing role of fungi. And specifically, it's in all of these because it does break down all kinds of things, like we talked about, dead material, also waste. But I also just wanted to mention that fungi are the only things that can break down wood. So like trees are made of wood, and we'll talk about exactly what wood means in a later lecture, but our wood has what's called lignin in it. And we can't digest lignin, neither can all your primary consumers, but fungi can break it down and break that carbon back down and put it into the soil to be used again. So that's an important role that fungi play in the carbon cycle. So I put this slide in here mostly to remind myself that fungi are the primary decomposers in a tertiary environment, but they are also present in marine environments and various aquatic environments as well. And your additional assignment for this week, you'll look into that a little bit more, but just wanted to mention it here because sometimes we think of mushrooms primarily, so we forget that there are also fungi that live in marine environments as well. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the economic importance of fungi. So what we mean by economics is just the human interaction, basically, with fungi. And that comes in multiple forms, some positive, some negative. If you look here at these oranges with these little fungi growing on it, some of my past students have said, hey, that looks very familiar. I know what that is. This little patch right here that you see, if you leave your oranges out too long, that'll start growing on it, and that is a fungus. Well, so one thing that sometimes people don't think about is that fungi have to compete for dead material or rotting fruit, for in this instance. Then they compete with bacteria. So what this fungus does is it produces penicillin. And penicillin is used, of course, to kill off the bacteria and to outcompete the bacteria for the rotting fruit. So it is a source of economic importance to us and health importance because this is where we extract penicillin from. Other things that are a little more common, of course, are foods like our mushrooms and any kind of time that we use yeast to make bread and cheese and beer. I put kombucha in here. That should be familiar to some of you. It's something that my daughter has used actually and made quite a bit. The SCOBY that you use to make kombucha is a fungi and bacteria symbiotic relationship. But then there's also the negative side of fungi and how people interact with it. First of all, crop destruction is very common with fungi. And then, of course, athlete's foot is something that would be familiar to some people, and that is a negative impact on humans from fungi. Okay, let's talk about the characteristics of the body of a fungi. It has 4 components to it that make it a fungal body. The first is probably the most important. They have a high surface area to volume ratio with what's called their hyphae, and we'll look at that in a little bit. They have cell walls made of chitin, which we've mentioned before. They have what's called a fruiting body, and they produce spores. So this is what it looks like in terms of if we were looking at a mushroom. So the fruiting body is this whole top portion of your fungi. And what that is used for is to reproduce, to produce those spores and get them off the ground and out into the air so they can spread. So that's the fruiting body. That's the above ground structure. The below ground structure right here is called the mycelia or the mycelium. Mycelium being singular. And it's a branching network. It looks like roots, but it's not a root. A root is very specific to the plant kingdom, so it's not in a fungal kingdom. But it does anchor the fruiting body into the substrate, whether that be the rotting fruit or into the ground or into like dead wood that's rotting. But both the fruiting body and the mycelia are made up of what we call hyphae. Excuse me. And they're individual strands, and they are used in nutrient transport and nutrient absorption. When they're densely packed in the fruiting body, it's to provide structure to that fruiting body. So our hyphal strands can be divided into 2 different types. One is a septate hyphae and the other is aseptate. So aseptate, which is the one on the right, has no compartmentalization. So as you can see, it's just free flowing, and you have a cell wall and nuclei with no separation between the cells. Excuse me. A septate hyphae has perforation in the cell membranes and walls and partial compartmentalization because of that. So if you're looking over here right there, you can see a pore in a septum. Well, that septum allows for some compartmentalization, but the pore still allows for various substances like nutrients to be passed along kind of down the strand. So here's a better picture of these. Again, A would be the aseptate hyphae and B would be the septate hyphae, because you can see the septum that divides. And then in the middle image there, that's an electron micrograph, and you can see where those pores are located. Right here is that kind of conjunction between the two different cells. So those pores allow for molecules to pass between the cells. That makes this a multicellular organism, not a colonial group of organisms. When we look at these hyphal cells, the thing that sticks out the most is that all of the cells are pretty small, and therefore they have a high surface area to volume ratio. So if you look at these three different cells, the one on the far left would represent a hyphae cell. So if you look, it has lots of areas where absorption can take place. As the cells get larger, that absorption means that that nutrient has to pass a lot more space before it can fill up the cells. So it's advantageous for the hyphae to have a high surface area to volume ratio. Now, one thing that this does mean also is that it can dry out really quickly, because water can pass through that way pretty fast as well. So that's why fungus like to live in moist environments. They can't be dried out. Okay, so like we said, hyphae help the fungi in their mode of nutrition, which is absorptive heterotrophs. So a couple of things for you to know about this. Hyphae are able to sense where the nutrients are and to grow in that direction. And so they have what we call a Spitzenkorper. So if you see that term over here on the right in green, a Spitzenkorper is a dense area of vesicles that are, here we go. Woo, that is some bad drawing right there. But they're circled here at the tip. You can see that large number of vesicles right there. That allows for polarized growth of the hyphae. So all those vesicles are being sent to the end to create additional new cell wall material and to add to the growth of the hyphae. So they sense their nutrients and they grow in that direction. They also use this same area, the Spitzenkorper, to excrete enzymes into their environment. Remember we said that digestion precedes ingestion, so it releases secretory enzymes into the environment to break down the nutrients, and then they absorb it. So here we go to say it again. Probably can't say it enough, right? So here we go. Digestion precedes ingestion, because that's what makes a fungus a fungus. So the ways that our fungus obtain nutrients is that, like we said before, they are either parasitic or saprophytic for the most part. Excuse me. So they grow over their host if they're a parasite, or they grow over like the dead organic material, and then they release digestive enzymes into an extracellular region. So those can be proteases, lipases to break down proteins and lipids, any number of enzymes. Then once it's all broken down, then they can absorb the nutrition. So here is an image of chitin. It's the polysaccharide made out of interlocking molecules of NAG. And this is what distinguishes fungi, or one of the things that distinguishes it from plants. Plant cell walls are made up of cellulose. So here's the interesting part. Animals, including humans, can digest chitin. We have an enzyme called chitinase, and that breaks down chitin. So we can easily digest fungi. Plants, on the other hand, we actually cannot by ourselves digest cellulose. So we, in our gut, have bacteria that can break down the cellulose. So that's a symbiotic relationship that we have that we depend on in order to digest plants. So we've talked a lot about hyphae, and remember, those hyphal strands make up the fruiting body and the mycelium. So the mycelium is the mass of hyphae that is found underground or in a substrate. So here on our lovely strawberry, this is the portion that's right in there in the strawberry, holding that fungus in. So I wanted to mention this just because it's really fascinating. There's what's called the humongous fungus, that's what we call it, or it's actually a honey fungus, and it's the world's largest organism. It covers 2,200 acres in Oregon in Mahler's National Forest. As far as we know, it's the oldest known organism. It's 2,400 years old. It is a parasitic fungus that feeds on the roots of conifers. And excuse me, conifers, you'll learn later, is a particular type of tree that is a resident in the National Forest. So it covers that whole entire area. And in addition, it's bioluminescent. So if you look over here to the left, it glows in the dark. So it's the oldest and largest known organism. Okay, we talked about the mycelium and the fruiting body, which is the second part of our fungus. Remember, still made up of hyphae. And it is responsible for reproduction. It produces what's called a sporangia, which is an enclosure where spores are formed. And that happens as a result of sexual reproduction when two hyphae, a positive strand and a negative, we don't have male and female, we have positive and negative, come together forming a mycelium with sporangia. So when the sporangia burst, the spores are released from the fruiting body. And that's how we get them out and into the air. So this is important for us to go through, the life cycle basically of fungi. So if you notice on the left side, we mentioned two different strands, a positive strand and a negative strand. When they come together, notice that each one of those is haploid, one N each. Each one of these yellow blocks represents one cell, okay? So it starts by the cytoplasmic fusion of these two cells. So the cytoplasms come together, and now we have two cells that are what is called dikaryotic. That means it has one N plus one N in each cell. So two haploid copies of the DNA. Okay, two different forms of DNA. That's the first step. Then after that, nuclear fusion occurs. Now, nuclear fusion is just what it sounds like. The nucleus or the nuclei fuse together, and that's when we get a diploid stage. So now notice that the cells are each diploid, and that's our zygote stage. That zygote, of course, is going to undergo meiosis within the sporangia like we talked about, And so spores will form. And so meiosis then allowed these spores to be 1N. And from those spores, a new mycelium grows. And then the life cycle starts all over again. But this dikaryotic region is probably new to you. But it just means it has both copies of DNA, but they haven't fused together yet. So we talked about sexual reproduction, and so I'd like to also mention asexual reproduction, which is usually the predominant way that fungi reproduce. So there are 3 different types. There's asexual spore reproduction that can occur. There's fragmentation, which means a piece of the hyphae breaks off and starts its own new fungal unit. And then there's budding, which is what occurs in yeast, where it's almost like the cell just gets pinched off into a new organism. Okay, so let's look at our 3 modes of nutrition with our fungi. And in every one, we still know that digestion precedes ingestion in all of these modes. So the first one is saprophytic. Just like we talked about, that is our dead and decaying material. Those are our decomposers. But fungi can also be parasitic and can be mutualistic symbionts, so involved in a symbiotic relationship. So this should be one that you could see on a regular basis, and in fact we're going to hopefully take a field trip in our lab time to be able to look at some of these. So our saprophytes use non-living organic material. So they are the important decomposers. And you can see these shelf fungi over here on a dead wooden branch. Just helps to break down dead and decaying material. Our parasites use organic material from living organisms, harming them in some way. That's kind of the definition of a parasite. And the range of hosts is huge, from diatoms that we looked at, to humans, to ants, to plants. All kinds of things are affected by parasitic fungi. I like to show this because it's pretty fascinating to me. We have our plant fungi on the left. Usually that is called a blight if it has a big impact. This one in the middle is pretty fascinating. This one right here is a fungi that has entrapped a nematode because it is actually a little predatory. When it feels it comes by, it sends out almost like a harpoon to grab it. So I don't know if that's necessarily parasitic, but definitely is harmful. Predatory is how I would have said that. And then over here on the right, I just feel so sorry for this poor ant. Do you see this fruiting body of a fungus coming up out of that ant's head? So sad. Okay, and then there's our mutualistic symbionts. And this is where the fungi have a mutually beneficial relationship with other living organisms. And the 2 that we're going to focus on the most are mycorrhizae and lichens. Mycorrhizae are where fungus has a beneficial relationship with a plant root. And more than 90% of plants in nature naturally have these occurring. And our second group is our lichens, and that's the association of a fungus with an algae or a cyanobacteria. And they're the autotroph in that one, either the algae or the cyanobacteria, provides sugars for the fungi. And then the fungi break down rocks and turn it into soil and release critical minerals that the plants require. So the image on the right is probably a familiar one to you, but it's lichen over rock material. So this is a breakdown. This is in your textbook. I just wanted to very quickly mention to you that fungi are typically categorized by their mode of nutrition. So when we start looking at this in our next lecture, just know that that's coming. It's primarily through their mode of nutrition and secondarily through their life cycle. So these are the different categories that we're going to be going over. In our next lecture, we will have a chart to fill out so we can compare and contrast the different groups of fungi. So thanks for being fun guys today.